Indians would have you believe that their freedom struggle against the British was justified and ours is illegal. And I remind you that they were a colonized people and now they've become the colonizer. Thank you, Mr. President. By the way, this isn't the first... This isn't the first time that you've been accused of being a Pakistani and also an asset of their intelligence agency. Their predecessors also did the same thing, by the way. So these dirty tactics India employs to discredit any conversation on Kashmir that isn't in their favor is nothing new to us. I've experienced it my whole life, especially over the last couple of weeks, as most of you might know. The way that Kashmiris understand this motion. Rejected! Rejected!
On a point of order. Only the member recognized will be allowed to speak. If you continue
Rejected! Rejected! The way Kashmiris understand this motion is in the context of UN resolutions and the UN Charter, which is the right to self-determination. I won't be arguing for a final settlement, as it would discredit and dishonor those who fought and sacrificed for the right to decide, be it independence, be it for Pakistan, even for India. So the opposition shouldn't have a problem now that the language has changed. Now the Indian team will claim and have claimed that Kashmir is their integral part, that the Maharaja signed the instrument of accession affirming that Jammu and Kashmir joined the Indian Dominion in 1947. But for the people of Kashmir, the right to decide their freedom isn't an arbitrary desire. And in fact, it predates the birth of India, at least since 1931. Now, the opposition has regurgitated 7 decades of propaganda presented as history in an attempt to whitewash and justify India's occupation and crimes in Kashmir. And I don't know if you've been briefed by the Ministry of External Affairs and their affiliates, so I won't accuse you of peddling the government line. And instead, I'll question your real-world knowledge and understanding of Kashmir beyond the prism of hyper-nationalism. So context. Some people talked about the history, maybe I'll give it a little bit more. Many have ruled Kashmir over the last 500 years. The Shahmiri dynasty of Turco-Persian descent, the Chaks who came from Gilgit, the Mughals, the Duranis, and of course the Sikh Empire. And the British Empire defeated the Sikhs and sold Kashmir for about £500,000 in today's money to the Prince of Jammu. That formed the state of Jammu and Kashmir in 1846 by virtue of the Treaty of Amritsar, a bargain between 3 thieves for a booty which didn't belong to any of them. In fact, the British Prime Minister ultimately responsible for that sale is a product of this very university, Sir Robert Peel. And when the line of demarcation was drawn up for partitioning the subcontinent, that was also done by a product of this university, Sir Radcliffe. In Anthony Reid's book, India's Long Road to Independence, he finds that Radcliffe was commissioned for the job specifically because he would act in serving British interests. One of those interests was to thwart Soviet influence in the region, but more importantly, to maintain their own influence post-partition and keep the subcontinent prepared for the rising idea of her client neo-colonist. Kashmir historically, culturally, religiously, and economically has always been on the periphery of the Central Asian landmass, but it was the Sikh Empire who linked Kashmir politically and militarily to the subcontinent, which the British continued. Now, the opposition will argue, and have argued, that the instrument of accession signed by the Maharaja in 1947 is conclusive. Numerous scholars, historians, and academics have disputed the legitimacy of the document. People like Alistair Lamb, people like Andrew Whitehead, Christopher Snedden, and most importantly, Victoria Schofield. The opposition will attempt to discredit their work and claim I'm misrepresenting them. And that's easy to claim behind someone's back. So allow me to introduce another product of this university. An authority on Kashmir, an unconditional friend to Kashmir, my friend and mentor, Ms. Victoria Schofield. I dare any of you to dismiss her the way that you dismiss Kashmiris when we speak about our nation and our people and what we've suffered. Another contested state was Junagadh, with a Muslim ruler and Hindu subjects who had executed their instrument of accession with Pakistan on August 15, 1947, which was duly accepted by Pakistan, yet India still occupied the territory. And their argument, it was a Hindu majority state. And just because it had a Muslim ruler, the land must go to India. And of course India held a referendum because they knew the outcome would be in their favor. Had the Muslim population of Kashmir been given the same, they would have decided at that time to accede to Pakistan based on the two-nation theory, or at least on the basis of demography. But India decided that a Hindu ruler's decision was final. In fact, in 2010, Chatham House conducted a survey where they reported that even after 60 years, the people of Kashmir do not want to be a part of India. In fact, I have that report somewhere, which I might show later. Now, if Kashmiris were ever to be given a referendum, it would only happen after the settler colonial project to force demographic change has been completed. You only need to look at the events, as some people have already mentioned, about August 5th, 2019, when Kashmir's so-called special status was revoked, turning the territory from a de facto occupation to a de jure occupation. Even if we accept the instrument of accession just for a moment, it was supposed to be temporary and on the basis that the people were to be given the decide their future. It's not just the qualified people in the world who have stated it. Former Secretary of the Government of India at the time, VP Menon, says so in his book. And if you know who VP Menon is, then you won't question it. But if you do, and that's not enough, Karan Singh, the son of Hari Singh, who signed that alleged document, confirmed the same thing on record in the Indian Parliament in 2016. But 72 years later, the promise was broken, UN resolutions unfulfilled, and India unilaterally absorbed the land and its people. More evidence. The plebiscite was promised by India's first Prime Minister Nehru, and it was India who took the issue of Kashmir to the United Nations. And since then, 18 Security Council resolutions have been passed. It was their Prime Minister who said in the heart of Kashmir's capital, and in the Indian Parliament, by the way, India does not believe in forced marriages. And in the context of forced marriages, we now hear BJP leaders like Vikram Saini urging Indians to marry fair-skinned Kashmiri girls as if our women are commodities. And comments like that aren't a one-off. Another BJP leader, Vikram Randhawa, called for Kashmiris to be skinned alive. And these aren't the only examples, and I have them right here. If anybody wants to dispute them, you can have a look at them right here. And these aren't the only examples, and not from 1947 like the Jammu genocide where 500,000 people were killed and 250,000 people disappeared in a couple of weeks. And that's reported by the editor of The Statesman, Ian Stevens. These are recent examples that I'm giving. Bipin Rawat, India's Chief of Defense Staff, he complained that protesters were carrying guns, and that was a problem because it would be easier to justify killing them. Army officers screaming for rape on Indian news channels. 18th-month-old Hibba Nisar shot with pellets and blinded while she sat in her mother's lap. Journalists like Fahad Shah, Qazi Shibli, Sajjad Gul and Asif Sultan jailed for years for doing their job. 8-year-old Samir Rah, who was picked up after he went out to play, and when his body returned home, it was indicated that he was beaten by military weapons. Mubina Ganai was raped and gang raped on her wedding night. Parveena Ahangar's son was a victim of enforced disappearance 30 years ago. She's still roaming around looking for him. 9-month pregnant Tamanna was 9 months pregnant when she was raped and gang raped by the Indian army and gave birth to a son 3 days later. 5-year-old Nasir was picked up by the Indian army, his eye punctured with a sharp object and sand poured into it. 2 entire villages of women aged between 8 and 80, raped and gang raped in front of their families and their neighbors. Qalandar, who had both his legs amputated and then force-fed his own flesh. Abductees tortured in mosques under loudspeaker to instill fear and terror in the population, happening in my hometown with my families. So don't tell me what the reality inside Kashmir is. Civilians used as human shields, and the officer responsible for it given an award. Cargo and Papatu are torture centers in Kashmir where pliers were used to pull people's fingernails out. Inmates electrocuted, sodomized, and rats used to feast on their scarred bodies. The burning of bodies and burying them in far-flung locations and not returning them to the families. Thousands of unmarked graves. I will not yield. PhD scholars like Ala Fazli jailed for an op-ed he wrote 11 years prior to being charged with terrorism and arrested. The murder and detention of legitimate political leadership under draconian laws. You must hear their names. Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani, Ashraf Sehrai, Mrs. Asiya Andrabi, Qasim Faktu, Mrs. Nahida Nasreen, Yasin Malik, Ms. Fahmida Sofi, Shabir Shah, Sarjan Barkati, Altaf Shah, former bar presidents Mia Qayyum and Nazir Ronga, even underage children aren't spared. And I won't even get into the transnational repression where India uses assassins to kill dissenters, home and abroad, including Kashmiris as well as Sikhs. As somebody was mentioning about Khalistan, I thought it's important to mention that it was Sikh, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, that was assassinated in Canada. A couple of months ago, even I was attacked on the streets of London after delivering a lecture and suffered a broken rib. And now, not recently, but quite a few years back, I was banned from traveling back to Kashmir. And in fact, we have so much more evidence that I'd like to submit this to you right now, if anybody'd like to read it. So many... It's all here. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of thousands dead, tens of thousands raped, billions in destruction, widows, half-widows, which is a term coined more recently, orphans, and the list is endless. The heartbeat of Kashmir civil society, Khurram Parvez, quoted and cited by the United Nations, attempted to document as much as he could before being jailed and charged with sedition, of all things. That's the cost of counting. The cost of recording and the cost of the truth. Not to mention how lawyer Jalil Andrabi was arrested to prevent him from appearing before the United Nations as a representative of the Kashmir Commission of Jurists. His cut-up dead body was found in the river with a bullet to the head and his eyes gouged out. Let me ask the opposition. Is freedom to decide one's destiny a right or not? Is it justified? At what point is it justified? When a nation alien to your religion and culture invades you, when they mercilessly kill you, starve you, and rape you, when you're massacred, used as human shields, mass and unmarked graves, torture, controlling the media, creating puppet leaders and client regimes, draconian laws. So I ask you again, it isn't a rhetorical question. And in fact, I'd probably ask the entire hall here tonight. Do atrocities against the people on a scale that can only be described as war crimes and genocide justify resistance and freedom? Does it? You're raising your hand. It was a rhetorical question. Look, this is the problem. This is the problem of Indian hypocrisy and ultranationalism. This is the problem of Indian hypocrisy and ultranationalism. Because India fought the British for exactly those reasons. I wasn't describing Kashmir. I was talking about how the Indians fought, and they call us terrorists and terror sympathizers. I will not yield. Indians would have you believe that their freedom struggle against the British was justified and ours is illegal. And I remind you that they were a colonized people, and now they've become the colonizer, the irony. Now, I'd refer you back to the United Nations, but I'm sure my opposition, extremely intelligent, wise opposition, will retort by saying the UN resolutions are no longer relevant and the situation in Kashmir has changed, which, by the way, is false. I'm still connected to the ground. Their argument, when broken down, is that my people collectively don't have the choice to decide our own political future. Interestingly, and I say this to you just as a side note, because I'll only take 2 more minutes. This university owes Kashmir those 2 minutes to complete, simply because of what Lord Sir Peel and Sir Radcliffe did to Kashmir. They owe me 2 minutes. This university owes me 2 minutes. Now, interestingly, the US was the principal sponsor of Security Council Resolution number 47, as somebody was talking about, adopted in April 48, with a firm backing of France and this country, stating verbatim, the future of Kashmir should be decided by the wishes and the will of the people. And both Pakistan and India were consulted and agreed to the resolution, yet India continues their violations. Now, you can say what you want about the United Nations, but the bedrock of the international system which emerged after the Second World War, what's now termed as the rules-based international order, is based on the UN Charter, which in turn stems from international law. So there can't be two standards for their application, that you can cherry-pick what suits you. That it's fine for the UN resolutions that are binding for the right to self-determination of East Timor and South Sudan, which, by the way, India supported, but not when it comes to Indian-occupied Kashmir. Now, my argument isn't that we deserve our freedom just because of human rights abuses, as in the case of Sudan and East Timor, but offers a very small glimpse at what generations of Kashmiris have suffered. So, tell me, where does it say anywhere in the United Nations that the Security Council resolutions are defunct after 7 decades or are time-bound in any way? If anything, India has taught us the route to permanent colonization, that given enough time, occupation can be legitimized, delayed by decades, and then use the excuse that Security Council resolutions, international law, Geneva Conventions, anything and everything no longer apply. And according to Forbes, India have turned Kashmir into the most militarized zone in the world, with some estimates of 1 armed personnel to every 10 civilians. And they employ unimaginable draconian laws that give them impunity and destroy lives. I'll only take 1 more minute. This is 1 more minute. This is what's led to the growth of indigenous groups like the TRF, PAFF, and Hizbul Mujahideen, lawfully engaged in a struggle for liberation, resisting the oppressor, and fighting to preserve our identity. It is our moral and legal right to resist by all means necessary, according to the UN documentation, which is right here. And those involved, as a closing, as those involved in armed resistance, they aren't illiterates. They're scholars like Manan Wani, teachers like Riaz Neku, students like Burhan Wani. And finally, in closing, India gaslights anything that we say. So if you're convinced of their arguments tonight, you're convinced of ethno-religious nationalist supremacy. You can only endorse the Indian position if you believe Kashmiris are cattle to be dictated to and slaughtered with no mind of our own and no rights. What's worse, you'd be endorsing the view that human rights and international law do not matter. Look, I'm closing now. One of the major sins in Hinduism is injustice against others. At least let me quote from the Bhagavad Gita. At least let me quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Last minute. Tolerating injustice is much a crime as committing injustice. It is your duty to fight injustice. Look, I'm stepping aside, I promise. This is the last minute. This evening's debate, look, now this is something that's a little bit more important. It's not facts, it's not figures. This isn't a history lesson anymore. This means something to us. This evening's debate isn't perfunctory for us, for Kashmiris at least. Nor is your vote a routine or a ritual. Millions of Kashmiris await your decision this historic night in these hallowed halls, because it actually means something to us, genuinely. That of all people, Oxfordians stood by us. They heard us. It will forever be a testament to your character. Be remembered by the beleaguered people of Kashmir for being on the right side of history. The least you can do while we face our annihilation, the least that you can do, is vote for us. It won't change anything for us. Nothing. Nothing. But it gives us hope. Thank you very much.